In the year 1500, beneath the vast expanse of the sky that stretched over the shimmering lake upon which Tenochtitlan was perched, the city thrummed with a pulse both vibrant and ominous. The grand causeways linking the island city to the mainland were alive with movement. But this was no ordinary day of commerce or celebration. The air was thick with the rhythmic beating of drums, their deep, resonant thumps echoing across the water and through the stone plazas. These were the drums of war, signaling a grim procession winding its way through the city's heart. Captured from distant battles against rival tribes, the prisoners were paraded as living trophies, their fate sealed by the gods and the will of the Aztec ruler. Among them was a young warrior named Cuautli, his name meaning eagle, a symbol of strength and freedom now cruelly betrayed by his shackles. His dark eyes, still bright despite exhaustion and fear, scanned the faces of his fellow captives, men and women from various tribes, each carrying the weight of defeat and the shadow of an uncertain future. The streets of Tenochtitlan, usually filled with merchants and citizens, had transformed into a stage for this grim spectacle. The populace lined the canals and causeways, their faces a mixture of reverence and dread, for these captives were not merely prisoners. They were offerings to the gods, sacrifices to sustain the sun and the cycles of life. The priests, robed in vibrant feathers and adorned with obsidian blades, led the procession, their chants weaving an unbroken thread of ancient prayers that sought to appease the divine forces governing the world. The Aztec Empire, at the height of its power, was a civilization built upon conquest and ritual. Its warriors were feared across the region, their campaigns relentless in expanding the empire's reach. Yet, the true heart of Aztec might was not just military prowess, but a complex religious system that demanded human lives in exchange for cosmic order. Capturing enemies alive was both a strategy and a sacred mandate, for it was believed that only living hearts could nourish the gods and ensure the continuity of day and night. Cuautli's own tribe had resisted fiercely, but the Aztec onslaught was overwhelming. Now, as he moved through the city streets, heavy chains biting into his wrists, the young warrior wrestled with the cruel reality that awaited him. His thoughts were a tempest of memories, of home, of family, of battles fought with honor, and of the uncertain destiny that loomed ahead. Around him, other captives bore their own burdens, the stoic gaze of Itzcuintli, an older warrior whose scars told stories of countless fights, the quiet despair in the eyes of a young woman clutching a small child, the trembling hands of a boy barely old enough to wield a spear. Despite the terror and confusion, there was an unspoken solidarity among the prisoners. They were bound not only by chains but by a shared fate, a collective defiance that flickered beneath the surface like a fragile flame. Cuautli drew strength from this, his heart beating not just with fear, but with a flicker of hope that perhaps, even in captivity, there was room for resistance. The Aztec priests moved with solemn purpose, their faces painted with intricate patterns symbolizing death and rebirth. They spoke in low, authoritative tones, invoking Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war, whose insatiable hunger demanded constant offerings. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the very stones understood the gravity of the moment. The Grand Templo Mayor, towering above the plazas like a sentinel, cast long shadows over the procession, its twin shrines dedicated to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, the rain god, standing as silent witnesses to the unfolding ritual. As the captives were funneled toward the temple precincts, the crowds behind them swelled with anticipation. For the citizens of Tenochtitlan, these sacrifices were not mere brutality but a sacred duty, a necessary exchange to maintain the balance between the mortal and divine worlds. Yet beneath the veneer of ritual lay a darker truth, one that history has often softened or ignored. The treatment of captives was not only a matter of honor but a calculated practice steeped in cruelty and psychological torment. The drums grew louder, their cadence quickening, mirroring the pounding of hearts both among the captives and the spectators. Cuautli felt the weight of the moment pressing down upon him, the enormity of the empire's machinery grinding inexorably toward its climax. He glanced around, noting how the city's grandeur, its towering pyramids, bustling markets, and vibrant murals, stood in stark contrast to the suffering carried by those who had fallen beneath its shadow. This was the Aztec world in full force, a civilization where beauty and terror coexisted, where faith demanded sacrifice, and where the line between life and death was both blurred and rigidly enforced. For Quatli and his fellow captives, the days ahead would unravel this terrifying dichotomy, revealing a reality far more harrowing than the myths that had long obscured the true nature of their fate. As the procession neared the temple steps, the priests raised their voices in a chant that filled the air with a haunting resonance, calling upon the gods to accept their offerings. The city watched in solemn reverence, the collective breath of thousands held captive in a moment suspended between hope and despair. Quatli's gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sun began its descent, casting the city in a fiery glow that seemed both beautiful and foreboding. In this moment, the young warrior understood that he stood at the threshold of a ritual that was less about honor and more about survival, an ordeal that would test the limits of his body and spirit. The Aztec Empire's relentless march of conquest had brought him here, to the heart of a civilization whose greatest power was rooted not only in its armies, but in the blood it demanded to sustain the world. The drums beat on, a relentless reminder of the fate that awaited. And as Quatli was led forward, his heart steeled against the unknown. The city around him thrummed with a dark promise, that the story of these captives was one of courage shadowed by cruelty, a chapter of history waiting to be fully told. The sun dipped lower beyond the city's jagged skyline, casting long shadows over the stone steps of the Templo Mayor as Quatli and the other captives were herded into the temple precincts. The air, once filled with the resonant beat of drums and the murmurs of the crowds, grew heavy with a suffocating stillness, broken only by the low, rhythmic chants of the priests. The captives, once prisoners of war, now found themselves prisoners of an ancient ritual whose true horrors were only beginning to reveal themselves. Quatli's wrists ached where the iron shackles bit into his flesh, but it was the gnawing fear within that tightened his chest. Around him, the faces of his fellow captives told stories of anguish, despair, and, in some, a flicker of defiance. Squintly, the older warrior who had remained stoic through their capture, now showed signs of exhaustion, his eyes clouded but unwavering. The young woman clutching her child trembled silently, her lips pressed into a thin line of resolve. The boy beside her, barely more than a child, stared blankly ahead, swallowed by the enormity of their fate. The priests, robed in elaborate feathered headdresses and adorned with jaguar pelts, moved with deliberate grace, their voices weaving a chant that seemed to twist the very air. They spoke in Nahuatl, their ancient tongue resonating with sacred invocation. Huitzilopochtli, the sun and war god, was invoked repeatedly, his hunger for sacrifice a force that bound the empire's destiny to the blood of the captives. But this was more than a simple offering. The captives were not merely taken to be swiftly sacrificed. They were to endure a calculated ordeal, a ritual that extended their suffering to a slow, agonizing crescendo. The priest's chants masked a cruelty hidden beneath layers of ceremony and symbolism. Quatli's thoughts spiraled as they were led to a designated holding area just below the temple's summit. The space was cramped and shadowed, the air thick with the scent of burning copal incense that mingled with the metallic tang of blood. Here, the captives were stripped of their belongings and given minimal sustenance, a deliberate deprivation meant to weaken their bodies and spirits in preparation for what was to come. Squintly, ever the pillar of strength, whispered words of encouragement to the younger prisoners, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "We are not just sacrifices," he said quietly to Quatli. "We are the last defenders of our people's honor. Remember who you are." Quatli clung to these words, a fragile shield against the encroaching despair. The priests began the preparations with meticulous care. They anointed the captives' bodies with oils and painted intricate designs in red and black, symbols that marked them as chosen offerings. The captives' limbs were bound with cords dyed in the colors of the gods, binding them not just physically but spiritually to the ritual's demands. The elaborate costumes and markings transformed them into living embodiments of sacrifice, their humanity subsumed beneath layers of sacred symbolism. Yet beneath this ceremonial veneer lay a grim reality. The captives were subjected to psychological torment that gnawed at their resolve. Public humiliation was routine. They were displayed before the gathered populace, stripped of dignity as the crowd jeered or offered prayers that mingled hope with dread. The priests wielded their authority like weapons, reminding the captives that their fate was sealed by divine decree, that resistance was not only futile but sacrilegious. Quatli observed how the priests moved among them with a chilling detachment, their faces masks of devotion that concealed a cold efficiency. They measured out rations sparingly, ensuring the captives weakened without losing consciousness. Sleep was disturbed by the sounds of distant drums and the cries of others undergoing similar fates. The captives' bodies were pushed to the brink, a slow erosion designed to break both flesh and spirit. In the quiet moments between rituals, Quatli found himself locked in silent conversations with Squintly and the others. They shared memories of battles past, of loved ones left behind, and of the gods they once revered. These fragments of hope were fragile, yet they tethered the captives to a world beyond the temple walls, a world they feared they might never see again. The priests' rituals grew increasingly elaborate as the days passed. The captives were bathed in sacred waters, their bodies smeared with sacred pigments meant to purify and prepare them. They were made to fast intermittently, a test of endurance that drained their strength. The ceremonies were performed with a solemnity that belied their brutality, the chants swelling into crescendos that echoed through the stone halls, enveloping the captives in a soundscape both mesmerizing and menacing. Quatli's mind raced with questions he dared not voice. What awaited them atop the temple? How would the gods receive their offerings? Was there any mercy in these demands, or were they condemned to a slow, torturous death? The uncertainty was a torment of its own, each unanswered question a blade twisting deeper into his resolve. Squintly, sensing the young warrior's turmoil, clasped his shoulder firmly. Remember, the gods demand this. Our lives may end, but our spirits will nourish the sun. The older man's words were both a comfort and a curse, a reminder that their suffering was meant to sustain forces far beyond their understanding or control. The captives' ordeal was not limited to physical degradation. The psychological games played by the priests heightened their torment. Some captives were singled out for mock ceremonies, paraded in front of the crowd only to be returned to the holding chambers, their hopes cruelly razed and shattered. Others were subjected to ritualized mutilations, small cuts, and burns that marked them as offerings, preludes to the final sacrifice. Yet, beneath the surface of fear and pain, a subtle resistance took shape. Quatli and Squintly exchanged glances that spoke of unspoken plans, of a defiance that refused to be extinguished. Their spirits, though battered, clung to the memory of home and the possibility of honor in the face of death. As the sun set beyond the lake, casting the city in hues of blood and fire, the captives were gathered once more for a final ceremony before the ascent to the temple's summit. The priests' chants rose in intensity, their voices weaving a tapestry of solemnity and dread. The captives, marked and bound, were led forward like offerings to a ravenous altar. In those moments, the true nature of the Aztec ritual began to reveal itself, not merely a sacrifice, but a protracted ordeal designed to extend agony and humiliation, a testament to the empire's demand for both spiritual and physical submission. Quatli's heart beat fiercely against the weight of chains and fate, the drums echoing the relentless march toward a destiny wrought in blood and fire. The climb to the summit of the Templo Mayor was a grueling ascent, each step weighted with the knowledge that the captives were nearing the final stage of their ordeal. The stone stairs, worn smooth by generations of ritual feet, rose sharply against the sky, a path both physical and symbolic that led directly to the altar where fate awaited. Quatli's legs trembled beneath him, not only from exhaustion, but from the heavy burden of what was to come. At the pinnacle, the temple's altar sprawled beneath the vast expanse of the sky, a platform of blood-stained stone carved with ancient glyphs and symbols of sacrifice. It was here that the Aztec priests performed the sacred rite, the moment when the captives' lives were offered to Huitzilopochtli, the sun god whose hunger was as eternal as the rising dawn. But the ritual was more than a swift death. It was the culmination of a calculated ordeal that stretched suffering across hours, even days. Quatli's eyes scanned the faces of his fellow captives, each marked by the harrowing path that had led them here. It squintly, stoic still but visibly weakened, stood beside him. The young woman with the child was absent now. Her fate had been sealed earlier, a reminder of the merciless hierarchy imposed even among prisoners. The boy, once wide-eyed and trembling, now showed a mask of numb resignation. The priests moved with an almost mechanical precision, their obsidian blades gleaming ominously in the fading light. The crowd below, gathered in the plazas and along the causeways, watched in breathless silence, their chants a distant thunder that seemed to shake the very earth. The ritual was a performance of power and faith, a spectacle designed to both honor the gods and reinforce the empire's dominion. As the captives were bound to the stone altar, Quatli's senses sharpened to every detail. The rough texture of the stone beneath his skin, the sharp scent of incense mingling with sweat and blood, the distant cries of the crowd interwoven with the priest's solemn chants. His heart hammered fiercely, a wild drumbeat against the inevitability of death. But death, as the ritual unfolded, was only part of the torment. The priests began with ritualized mutilations, deliberate and ceremonial wounds that drew blood not merely as a sacrifice, but as a form of prolonged agony. Small cuts traced along limbs and torso, symbolic markings meant to embody the suffering required by the gods. To the onlookers, these acts were sacred, but to the captives, they were a slow unraveling of flesh and spirit. Quatli felt the sting of the obsidian blade as it grazed his skin, a searing pain that blazed through his body. Yet, he gritted his teeth and met the gaze of it Squintly, who offered a faint, grim smile, a silent vow of shared endurance. The older warrior's presence was a slender thread of strength in the maelstrom of anguish. The ritual escalated, the priests chanting louder, their voices rising like a tempest as they prepared for the final act. Quatli's mind raced, memories flickering like shadows, of his village, the laughter of his kin, the courage that had carried him through countless battles. These memories became both refuge and torment, reminders of a life slipping away with each passing second. The final moment came swiftly, yet it was not a release, but a continuation of suffering. As the priest lifted the obsidian blade, Quatli's breath caught in his throat. The blade descended, severing flesh and spirit in one swift motion, but the pain did not end there. The ritual demanded that the heart be torn from the living chest, an act both brutal and symbolic, believed to feed the sun and ensure its rise. Squintly's fate was different. He endured a more drawn-out torment, subjected to ritual mutilations that stretched his agony, a grim testament to the hierarchy, even in death. His eyes closed slowly, a mixture of pain and acceptance etched upon his face. The captive's ordeal was a testament to the extremes demanded by Aztec society, a civilization where religious zeal intertwined with political power to create a system that consumed human lives in vast numbers. The ritual sacrifices were not merely acts of devotion but instruments of control, reinforcing the empire's dominance through fear and spectacle. As Quatli's life ebbed away, he clung to a final spark of defiance. His spirit, though battered and broken, refused to submit entirely. In those fleeting moments, the bonds forged with his fellow captives, the shared glances, the whispered prayers, became a silent rebellion against the empire's cruelty. The priests performed the ceremonies with unyielding devotion, their faces impassive masks beneath feathered headdresses. To them, these acts were sacred duties, a bridge between the mortal and divine realms. Yet, beneath the ritual's grandeur lay an unvarnished reality. The captives endured a protracted agony, a slow death masked by the sanctity of tradition. The crowd below, enraptured by the spectacle, saw only the surface, the glory of sacrifice, the favor of the gods. Few glimpsed the torment etched into every movement, the fear and despair hidden behind the captives' stoic facades. The narrative of honor and devotion concealed the brutal machinery of suffering that underpinned the empire's expansion. Quatli's final breath was a whispered invocation, a plea to the gods and the memory of his people. His body, once vibrant with life and battle, now lay still atop the altar, a vessel emptied but not defeated. The ritual concluded, the priests descended, their chants fading into the evening air as the city resumed its relentless rhythm. Yet, the story of Cuautli and his fellow captives was far from forgotten. Their ordeal symbolized the immense human cost of Aztec conquest. The lives sacrificed not only to appease gods, but to sustain an empire built on fear and blood. The slow, ritualized cruelty they endured was a stark counterpoint to the grandeur of the civilization that claimed them. In the shadows of the towering pyramids, the echoes of their suffering lingered, a haunting reminder of the price exacted by empire and faith alike. Their sacrifice, intended to nourish the sun, became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit even in the face of unspeakable cruelty. The Aztec rituals, with their blend of devotion and brutality, foreshadowed the empire's eventual unraveling, a society strained by its own demands, vulnerable to the forces that would soon challenge its dominion. The captives, though silenced in death, bore witness to a civilization's darkest depths, their stories a vital thread in the tapestry of history that too often remains obscured. Years later, beneath the soil of what was once the great city of Tenochtitlan, archaeologists uncovered fragments of a story long buried, bones, obsidian blades, and remnants of ceremonial artifacts that whispered of lives sacrificed in the name of gods and empire. These discoveries, painstakingly unearthed, challenged the sanitized narratives that had, for centuries, portrayed the Aztec civilization as simply a majestic empire of art and conquest. The truth was far more complex, more haunting. The captive warriors, like Cuautli and Itzcuintli, had been venerated and discarded in equal measure. Their bodies, once offered atop the towering pyramids, had been cast into mass graves, their identities erased beneath layers of earth and time. Yet in their sacrifice lay a legacy, a scar etched into history that modern scholarship has begun to reveal with unflinching clarity. Through the meticulous work of historians and archaeologists, the brutal reality of Aztec ritual sacrifices has come into sharper focus. The extended suffering endured by captives, the elaborate ceremonies that masked systematic cruelty, and the psychological torment inflicted upon those chosen to die. These elements paint a picture of a society where religion and power were entwined in a dance of dominance and submission. The captive stories, long overshadowed by the grandeur of Aztec architecture and mythology, have emerged as vital testimonies to the human cost of empire building. Their faces, once anonymous beneath layers of time, now speak through the artifacts and bones uncovered, offering a voice to those silenced by ritual and conquest. This new understanding compels us to confront uncomfortable truths, that devotion can mask cruelty, that empire often demands sacrifice not only of land but of lives, and that history is written as much by those who suffer as by those who conquer. The captive's ordeal is a mirror reflecting the harsh realities behind the glittering facade of Aztec civilization. In reflecting on these revelations, it becomes clear that honoring the memory of warriors like Cuautli is essential, not only as a recognition of their suffering, but as a challenge to the narratives that have too often romanticized or obscured the darker chapters of history. Their stories demand that we look beyond myth and legend, that we acknowledge the full spectrum of human experience, and that we remember the price paid by those caught in the tides of conquest and faith. The legacy of the Aztec captives endures not only in the bones beneath the earth, but in the lessons they impart. Their sacrifice, though born of brutality, speaks to a resilience of spirit that transcends time, a silent testament to lives lived and lost in the shadow of empire. As modern eyes peer back through the veil of centuries, these stories invite a deeper inquiry, a more nuanced understanding of a civilization as complex as it was cruel. Through this lens, the Aztec Empire is neither merely a tale of glory nor solely one of horror, but a mosaic of human triumph and tragedy. The captive's plight reminds us that history is incomplete without acknowledging those who paid the ultimate price, and that true remembrance requires facing the past in all its painful truth. In honoring their memory, we honor the humanity that endured beneath the weight of gods and empires alike, an enduring light shining through the darkness of forgotten sacrifice.